Tonight we make a transition to evidential apologetics, and the first item that we'll deal with is the problem of history. And here our broad question is history knowable? Some have challenged whether history is knowable or the results of history, so I think it's important, since much of our apologetic, at least half of it in terms of classical apologetics, is completely grounded in history, and as we'll see, Christianity is rooted in history as well. It becomes very important to deal with the issue of subjectivity or relativism related to history, and also discover if indeed the knowledge we're arriving at historically can be said to be objectively true, that is, apply to everyone, everywhere, for all time. Our objectives for tonight: one is to defend the knowability of history, two, answer arguments against the knowability of history, and three, to identify a proper methodology for developing a historical hypothesis. Our outline of what we'll cover tonight: first we'll deal with the issue of Christianity and its claims related to history. Then we'll look at a critique of historical relativism. In this we'll cover two major areas. One is a lack of direct access that is claimed by the historical relativist concerning the historian. And second, the lack of objectivity in his investigation. These are the two central areas that we'll need to delve into and answer some objections to in order to clear the way for doing historical apologetics. And then the last area is the nature and methodology of the historical inquiry. Certainly, we want to lay down a methodology that is sound and acceptable to the historian and his subject. We want to understand properly the very nature of history as a subject, and just clear the way of any problems related to going right into an evidential historical apologetic for Christianity. So first, let's look briefly at the Christian claims and history. I think apologist William Lane Craig has put it as well as any. Christianity is rooted in real historical events. To some, this is scandalous because it means that the truth of Christianity is bound up with the truth of certain historical facts, such that if those facts should be disproved, so would Christianity. But at the same time, this makes Christianity unique because, unlike most other world religions, we now have a means of verifying its truth by historical evidence. When you look at the history of apologetics in terms of its evidential or historical apologetics, it really did not begin until the late 1400s and kind of fell on the heels of the Italian Renaissance. The medieval period before that time did very little with respect to historical apologetics. It dealt with miracles and prophecy and pointed to the growth and spread of Christianity, but it really didn't have a critical inquiry into the question of history itself, or really deal with a proper historical methodology in any sense. It actually wasn't until Hugo Grotius in 1627, who was the first Protestant to really take a good look at history and employ historical arguments for the Christian faith. And of course, he did rely on some predecessors, one being Juan Lewis, who was a Spanish humanist, and Mornay, Philippe de Moray, who was a French Protestant reformer. But short of this, the notion of dealing with the problem of history or the objectivity of history, having to argue against relativism, is really a late comer to the area of apologetics. But it's really true to note that the earliest Christians, Paul especially, identified how rooted Christianity was in terms of history, and he clearly set forth the notion that if something, namely the resurrection, was to be disproved, then their faith was in vain. He says in 1 Corinthians 15, 12 through 17, "Now if Christ is preached that he has been raised from the dead, how do some of you say that there is no resurrection of the dead? But if there is no resurrection of the dead, not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is vain, your faith also is vain. Moreover, we are even found to be false witnesses of God, because we testify against God that he raised Christ, whom he did not raise, if in fact the dead are not raised. For if the dead are not raised, not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, your faith is worthless, you are in your sins. So right from the start, the very earliest Christians realized that what they were claiming about Jesus Christ was rooted in real historical events. As such, if they could be disproved, then it would bring down the Christian faith and show that it's in vain. And I think this is a unique claim of Christianity. I don't think there's any other religion that is as well grounded in actual historical events. You can take away the founder of any other religion, and you can take away a lot of the historical events of those religions, and you still have that religion and belief system intact. But you cannot do that with Christianity. You take away its founder, and you take away the historical events of it being founded, particularly with Jesus Christ and his life, death, burial, and resurrection, then you have done away with Christianity. We are completely, as an apologetic, dependent on history to establish our case at this point. So let's start with a critique of historical relativism. Probably the most important person to have come along in recent years to offer a case for historical relativism, or sometimes it's referred to as historical subjectivism, is Charles A. Beard, who wrote an essay in terms of laying out the attack on historical objectivity. And he leveled several areas of attack, but I think they can broadly be put into two areas, and we'll deal with one here and then another one later. The first one we'll deal with is a lack of direct access that's claimed with respect to the historian. And the second one that we'll deal with is a lack of objectivity. Here's a quote from him in his essay titled "That Noble Dream." He says this: "The historian is not an observer of the past that lies beyond his own time. He cannot see it objectively, as the chemist sees his test tubes and compounds. The historian must see the actuality of history through the medium of documentation. That is his sole recourse." So his claim was, because the historian does not have direct access to what he is studying, he can't repeat the past or go back into the past and observe what's going on. Because he can't do that, because he's removed from it, that puts him into the classification of not being able to have conclusions about his subject that are on the same par with other scientific inquiries that do have direct access. There's two things thrown at us with respect to this objection that we'll have to deal with. One is the notion of facts themselves. Facts, according to this view, are subjective to the historian. In other words, they have no meaning, since the historian must put his own meaning into the facts. Carl Becker said that historical facts, to give someone who takes this to the extreme, Carl Becker says that historical facts are only in the mind. In other words, he actually held the position that if everyone forgot the event, there would be no historical facts. And the second objection leveled at us that we must deal with is that there's no way to test the historical facts. There's no way to test any hypothesis in any real sense to compare it with what actually did happen. The scientist can test his method with experimentation, but the scientist cannot recreate, or the historian cannot recreate the past to test his hypothesis. So he certainly finds himself in quite a quandary, according to this view, not being able to come to any level of objectivity or certainty about what he's doing with respect to his discipline and subject. So let's first respond to this lack of direct access. And I want to point out first that I think it's quite naive to think that only history has no direct access to its subject, and hence only history is somehow put into the subjective category. I don't think that's true at all. Science is often indirect with respect to its access of its subject. Theoretical physics, the study of black holes, the study of subatomic particles such as quarks and neutrons. All of these, the physicist or the scientist does not have direct access to. Much of it is experimental, and yet at the same time, they're able to derive directly from their study of these things undisputable conclusions about these things, and they have no direct access to them. We have no direct access to black holes or to quarks or to neutrons, and nonetheless, they develop theories about these things, they test them, and they come to conclusions that are quite widely accepted within the scientific community. On a lower level with regards to scientific inquiry, there is no direct access to geological things like past ice ages. There's no direct access to living dinosaurs in the biological sciences. And of course, in astronomy, there's no direct access to galaxies. Everything is looked at with respect to these things as being indirect. Yet again, they're able to make conclusions about these things that are very widely accepted within the scientific community, and there seems to be no objection or serious objection to conclusions and hypotheses that are put forward in these areas. That being the case, they have a level of objectivity with respect to their investigation. History, we can also point out, does involve aspects that do involve direct access. And I think this is important to point out. Accessing literary sources, looking at linguistics, sociological issues, anthropological issues, and certainly a number of areas of archaeological discoveries would give the historian access to the past in a direct sense. I think that there's a good analogy to be made for the historian and also with at least one of the sciences, namely being geology. I think history is to the humanities what geology is to the sciences. One studies Earth's history, the other studies human history. And Dr. William Lane Craig makes this point, and I think he's right on. He says this: the historian's real work is the reconstruction and thought of a particular historical event. The geologist, the reconstruction and thought of a particular geological epoch at a particular place. Indirect access does not seem to stop the geologist from doing his task and making conclusions that are widely accepted within or among other geologists. So I think the historian should be in the same place. It shouldn't stop him from accessing these things directly or indirectly, making conclusions, submitting them to his peers to see if his conclusions can be accepted. I think that there is a more moderate objection that could be leveled at us that we do need to be aware of. Some will say that not everyone sees the things that the way that we do. Not everyone sees a historical event or understands a historical incident the way that we may be telling about it. But we have to ask ourselves, do they really understand the nature of history, and do they really understand what we are saying with respect to our assertion that a historical event happened or something took place? This is not really an objection, I think, to the objectivity of history. Rather, it's an issue of educating an individual about it. For example, I can be at a football game and know quite a bit about football and be sitting next to an individual that doesn't know anything about football, and I see one team score a touchdown, and I yell and I cheer and I'm happy and I'm glad, and the person looks at me and doesn't understand what has taken place. They don't cheer, they're not interested in what just happened, they don't even understand what's going on with respect to the game. Well, that person is just naive about the game. They need to be educated about the game. They don't see the game the way I see it because they lack an understanding or a knowledge about the game. So I think that this needs to be understood. Not everyone may see things the way that we do, but then they just need to be educated about it and the evidence brought forth. And then I think things would be cleared up. So again, this is a moderate objection that is often raised, but there's another issue that needs to be dealt with related to this, and that is the assertion that all observations are theory-laden. That is, all observations involve this notion of theory or perhaps even a worldview, and if that's the case, then we're just trapped into these observations that we make because behind it we have a certain theory, a certain hidden agenda that isn't quite apparent even to us as a historical investigator, but nonetheless is there, and it's guiding us ultimately to our conclusion. But this has been challenged by Frederick Coppelson, who is a philosopher of history. His 8 or 9 volume set is very good on a history of philosophy. And he wrote an article not too long ago dealing with this very issue related to history. And in it he said this: "Sometimes the available evidence is such as to eliminate any reasonable doubt about the validity of an interpretation. The historian is not free to interpret the text as he likes. Some statements may be ambiguous, but there are others the meaning of which is clearly determined independently of the historian's will." I think it's important to understand this point. There may be things to us as we investigate an ancient text that are very obscure to us, some things hard to understand, some things that we may not ever be able to come to a good, clear understanding of. But there are other things, as Frederick Coppelson says, that are beyond a dispute. Other things that don't depend on my theory or don't depend even on my worldview that clearly come through. In other words, texts have limits to their meaning. I can't make them mean whatever I want them to mean. I can't turn them into whatever I want to turn them into. And I think that there is some things, some issues which can be understood regardless of what one's theory is, what one's bent is, or what one's worldview is. They certainly can transcend the worldviews and actually be understood in an objective sense. In other words, not every difference is reducible to a worldview difference. One example are scientists that study the beginning of the universe. When we looked at the Kalam cosmological argument, there were many theories that were given with respect to the origin of the universe, the Big Bang or the Standard Model being one, and the steady state theory being another one. Well, both the scientists that were giving those very different theories to the beginning of the universe, or whether the universe had a beginning or not, had pretty much the same worldview in mind, and yet they came up with two very different theories. Now, as we continue to deal with the issue of investigating facts are subjective to the historian, there's a radical sense or a radical objection that is clearly self-defeating. It's a metaphysic objection, and the metaphysic objection that comes to us with respect to this assertion, I think, is clearly self-defeating. All history is subjective idealism, or no history is objective. Just seems very self-defeating, self-defying, and it goes against all common sense about the past. That the past really exists independent of myself. This metaphysic objection comes to us in the somewhat Kantian terms of a past in itself versus a past just to me, or that's subjective to me. But the notion of a past just to me or subjective to me is clearly self-defeating. The assertion all history is subjectivism or no history is objective just is self-destructive. It goes completely against a common sense understanding that says that the past really does exist and is independent of myself. Postmodernism sometimes wants to assert that language itself is the reality, that there's no reality that is extra or other than linguistic reality. But of course, this is self-defeating since they want to assert that's a reality that is past their linguistic understanding or their linguistic assertion. But certainly it puts the burden of proof on the person that says that history or historians' accounts are not of past events, but of the past itself. But this certainly puts the burden of proof, I think, on the person that's going to say historians' accounts of the past, or excuse me, historians' accounts are not of the past events, but the accounts themselves are the past. This would put someone in the position of saying that they can make the past to be whatever they want it to be. I don't think that's possible. Historical statements or claims about the past are not objectively true or knowable as something that is self-defeating. Either this statement is true or the statement is false. If it's true, then it is a statement made in the past that claims to apply to all historical statements. But of course, having it apply to all historical statements is the exact thing that we mean by objectivity. Hence, it's self-defeating. If it's false, then it leaves the door open for historical statements to be made that are objective and knowable. Now, there's a more moderate form of this. We've looked at the radical form. There's a more moderate form of this that says that the past is independent, but we cannot ultimately come to know the past. But I think this can easily be refuted by the notion that if this is entailed, then there's really no history between someone writing a fictional novel about the past and someone actually writing history. But this, again, goes against a common sense understanding. We can distinguish between fictional works of history that fit the classification of a novel from those who are actually writing history textbooks and doing historical studies. But again, if it's the case that we cannot come to know it, then we could never make a distinction between a novel and written history. But if we can make this distinction between that which is fiction and that which is history, then it stands that we can come to know the past and make this distinction. If you remember, one of the more radical assertions regarding this issue is that facts are subjective, or they have no meaning. The historian's statements ultimately have no meaning. But this is clearly self-refuting. Almost all of the apologists that deal with the history or this problem of historical relativism clearly show that facts do have meaning, and it's self-refuting to assert that facts have no meaning. It's absurd to think that facts exist only in the minds, as Becker wants us to believe. For example, Lincoln's death. Abraham Lincoln was assassinated on April 14th, 1865. If facts are subjective, if they exist only in the mind of the historian, then Lincoln's death, if everyone forgot that fact, would cease to be a historical fact. But this is just absurd. Lincoln's absence, Lincoln's real absence of having been assassinated because of him being assassinated is what made the difference in U.S. history, not mere memories of Lincoln. Facts exist independent of our minds and still have their impact long after we forget about them. Meaning is inherent in the very concept of fact, and there's no such thing as a meaningless fact. But I do want to issue a caution here, and Dr. Geiser issues this caution, and I think it is important because I think that there are some facts that are dependent upon our worldview, especially those facts that would lead us to, or tend to lead us to have to invoke a metaphysical notion or a metaphysical cause with respect to the historical event. He says this: it is self-defeating to affirm that there are any facts without meaning, since the very affirmation about the allegedly meaningless fact is a meaningful statement about the fact. Therefore, all facts are meaningful. There are no so-called bare facts. And then he follows up with this: but this argument does not really prove that facts speak for themselves. It does show that facts can and do bear meaning, But what it must prove and fails to prove is that facts bear only one meaning and that they bear it evidently. So I think it is important to understand that some facts are going to be completely dependent on one's worldview and one's worldview understanding, and especially those facts that are going to make an assertion about something that is happening in a metaphysical sense, not just a historical sense, but also involve a metaphysical sense of, for example, a supernatural event or a miracle, are going to be completely dependent upon one's worldview for that assertion and for that understanding. So it is important to understand that facts definitely are meaningful, and it's self-refuting or self-defeating to assert that facts do not have any meaning. But at the same time, it's important to recognize that there are some facts that are dependent upon our worldview understanding, and the worldview, and these facts can't argue our worldview for us. As we've noted it several times before, you must argue on other grounds than history for adjudicating between worldviews. The facts will not do that for you. You must have retort or return to history in order to adjudicate the truth of a worldview, which of course we've already done. Now we turn now to the second issue under the broad classification of the objection of not having direct access, where the objection is made that there's no way to test historical facts, or there's no way to test a hypothesis. So the historian may have access, as I've argued for, but how do we test to show that it actually took place? By what are we going to test it against? Well, it's important to point out that there really is no universal agreed upon methodology in history. In fact, later on I'll lay out a historical method, but I have to admit that you're not going to find universal agreement on it. You may find a lot of historians that will agree with the methodology that I lay out, but you certainly will find some that will poke holes in it or not completely agree with it. But I don't think that is the biggest worry we have with respect to the problem of history. Actually, there is a test that we can apply regardless of the methodology that we use in order to get to our hypothesis or set of facts that we want to assert. And that is the notion of logical consistency. And most historians will put forth this notion, which we've also put forth this notion in terms of our worldview, testing things within our worldview, must be submitted to logical consistency, or what we might refer to as coherence, and the ability to explain the evidence that's at hand, or the various facts that exist. So if I can put forth something that is, and compared to rival hypotheses, logically consistent, coherently explaining all the evidence that is put before us, then that is what the historian should put forth as a true hypothesis of what did in fact happen in the past. R.G. Collingwood says in his book, The Idea of History, the historian's picture of the past stands in a particular relation to something called evidence. The only way in which the historian can judge if it's truth is by considering this relation. I think this is what he's hinting at, is exactly what I've just explained to you. Again, methodology, as we'll see, is important, but it really is irrelevant when it comes to the actual test that we're going to put forth. What is relevant here is that we have consistently or coherently explained all of the evidence, and in comparison to rival hypotheses, ours is able to account for more of the evidence than any of the other ones, and is more consistent than any of the others, given the evidence at hand. We turn to our second objection. If you remember, we just looked at the lack of direct access. Now we want to look at the objection that has to do with the lack of objectivity. Here Charles Beard says, the historian seeking to know the past or about it does not bring to the partial documentation with which he works a perfect and polished neutral mind. Whatever acts of purification the historian may perform, he yet remains human, a creature of time, place, circumstances, interest, predilections, and culture. So here, the historian, even if we have corrected his lack of direct access, still, according to Beard, would have huge problems and be completely unable to overcome his setting and human condition to arrive at objectivity. And here we again have two objections that we're going to need to answer. One is the objection that each generation rewrites its own history. It would seem if history really is objective, there would be no need to rewrite it. Once it's written, once it's done, once it's laid out, if it's objectively true, that is, applies to everyone, why rewrite it? But the very fact that historians do rewrite histories of the past, it isn't just to sell books and to make money. It's because of their subjective conditions, according to the historical relativist position. And therefore, because of their different subjective condition and people who were previous to them, they rewrite history. And the second one has to do with the fact that all historians are selective and involve subjective interpretation. They're selective on the materials that they select to use to rewrite their history, and of course they make a subjective interpretation of those materials in order to produce their history. So let's first respond to the lack of objectivity by making an observation. First, this notion of not being objective I think does start to fall apart when we recognize that historical works can be false as opposed to true. If history was completely relative or completely subjective, this would not be possible. You wouldn't have conditions of true and false with respect to history if it was completely subjective. All histories would be different and on the same bar of being criticized, but that's just not the case. History can be criticized. We can show some historical positions to be false and others to be true based on the facts that exist. And it's also worth noting that there is a common core of indisputable historical facts that do in fact exist, as opposed to the notion that there are disputable facts. Again, if objectivity was not involved in these things, these conditions would not obtain at all. We wouldn't be able to come up with an indisputable historical core of facts that all historians agree upon. And also, we wouldn't be able to criticize facts that simply, from history, that simply don't have any backing to them whatsoever. There are indisputable facts. Let me give you a couple of them. The Declaration of Independence, that when it was written and what was said, is an indisputable fact. There are no historians that disagree with what the Declaration of Independence was and when it was done. Caesar crossing the Rubicon, Abraham Lincoln's assassination. These are facts that no historian would dispute. So that being the case, if we couldn't have objectivity in history, we couldn't have these undisputable facts. No one, of course, wants to abandon history as a hopeless sea of subjectivism. If so, then the relativist has really surrendered his point. Facts do have meaning, and they are objective. They've surrendered the notion of facts having no meaning and of facts being completely subjective. And I think it's also worth noting that history can be distinguished from propaganda as opposed to non-propaganda. Historians sometimes rewrite history, and sometimes they rewrite it wrongly. For example, the history of Russia, Stalin after the Bolshevik Revolution, which was led by Trotsky and Lenin, Stalin had the textbooks actually rewritten to say that it was led by Trotsky and himself. That being the case, because we can identify the wrong rewriting of history, again, I think it lends to an argument that there is objectivity in history, and there is agreement or complete agreement among historians regarding some historical things. If that wasn't the case, then we couldn't argue against the rewriting of history that is wrong. Finally, I think it's possible to criticize poor history as opposed to good history. Again, if we could not identify some works or some hypotheses being put forward as being bad history or poor history, this only makes sense in the presence of that which is good history. That being the case, this is only possible if indeed objectivity exists within history. Now, what about the objection leveled against our view that says that history, if it was objective, should not have to be rewritten? Well, there's a number of reasons why history needs to be rewritten, but it has nothing to do with negating objectivity. The nature of the subject itself is such that new evidences, new lines of reasoning regarding those evidences are certainly going to be discovered given enough time. That being the case, these understandings of new evidence have to be incorporated into the understanding of history or into the writing of history. So this is one reason why history does need to be rewritten. It has nothing to do with negating its objectivity. Also, language changes over time, so it becomes very important that history be updated to reflect the contemporary language that exists. And it's also worth noting that regardless of what time period in which history was written, there are some things that simply remain the same, that don't change. When Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, it doesn't matter when that history was written, it remains the same. The same thing with the Declaration of Independence or Caesar crossing the Rubicon. All those events remain the same. So there's clearly a core that remains the same, that isn't really challenged or changed. And that being the case shows the notion that there's a common core that is accepted by everyone, and of course that's what we mean by objectivity. Now, what about the response to our second issue that has to do with all historians are selective and involve subjective interpretation? Well, I think that Dr. Geiser handles this very admirably in his textbook, so I'll just quote him to help us out. The fact that the historian must select his materials does not automatically make history purely subjective. Jurors make judgments beyond a reasonable doubt without having all the evidence. If the historian has the relevant and crucial evidence, it will be sufficient to obtain objectivity. One need not know everything in order to know something. I think this is important. Everyone is selective, but the issue is, and the question is, do you have everything you need to develop a hypothesis and get it tested with respect to history? Do you have the right sources? Do you have the correct information, the right understanding, the right subjects relevant to your study? If that's being the case, then comprehensiveness is not always necessary. It's not necessary to be completely comprehensive, and in many cases it's not even possible to know everything. It becomes important to understand that it's just the crucial evidence and the relevant evidence that is most important. But related to this objective is the issue of presuppositions. And sometimes it will be put forth that everyone has presuppositions. And related to this is therefore there is no objective interpretation. But it's important to understand that we don't have to object to the notion of there being presuppositions or everyone having presuppositions, because this is the very thing that we mean by objectivity. This does not negate objectivity itself, since if everyone has presuppositions, it applies to everyone. That's the very notion of what we have with respect to objectivity. So the issue becomes not so much the problem of everyone having presuppositions, but dealing with the issue of what are the right presuppositions to have. What are the right pre-understandings to have with respect to one's worldview, or more importantly, with respect to the correct worldview? So I think these are clearly self-defeating, either indirectly or directly, because if the statement is true, then it must apply to every interpretation, including any interpretation of this very statement. But this would seem to entail that there is some objectivity or universal truth or principle of interpretation since it is applicable to all interpretations. The subjectivists may write books and write history, but they certainly don't expect you to use their principles of subjectivity to interpret their own books and for you to come to an understanding of it that is different than their understanding of it. So again, the issue is not presuppositions. The issue is what presuppositions are correct. And these notions that are being put forth by this understanding do not negate against the possibility of objectivity. Now, I think in conclusion of our evaluation here, I'll do a few things. Number one, I want to show how the relativist implicitly concedes the objectivity of history in at least three ways, and then I'm going to actually give a case for the objectivity of history. The first way, and I've mentioned these before, but I just want to bring them out explicitly. The first one is the notion that they claim to tell us what is the case about history. But if that's the case about history, that is the relativist case for history, it assumes that their view is true or truth. It's the true understanding of history. That being the case, they certainly want us to all objectively or universally accept their relativist understanding of history to be true. But of course, they have to assume objectivity and the absolute nature of truth in order to make that assertion. Two, they claim that their accounts better fit the evidence than their rivals. That is, their understanding of history is better than rival understanding of history. But of course here they also do the same thing. They rely on objectivity to make their case. They believe that their relativistic understanding of history is better than the objectivist understanding of history. But again, in order to make their case, they have to rely on an objective understanding because they want it to be universal and accepted by all historians. And third, they claim to reveal something about the way things are. That is, they make an assertion that this is the way history is to be understood. This is the way history is. It's relativist. But of course, that assumes that they actually know the reality of history, or know something in reality, namely the subject of history. But of course, this goes completely against their whole notion of history and how it works. Again, I think the whole notion of historical relativism completely self-destructs. It implodes upon itself. So I'd like to conclude this section by actually making the case for objectivity in history. What I've done so far is I've critiqued relativism, shown that it cannot hold itself up, much less any other view of history. So what I'd like to do is put forth the notion that there is objectivity in history. And of course, to do that, it takes us back to a debate we've already given that I'm just going to briefly remind you of, and that is the debate of relative truth versus absolute truth, because we're really revisiting that already all over again. All historical statements, that is, propositions about the past, if true, are objective. That is, they are true for everyone, for all of time, in every place. If it is true, then we understand it to be absolute. It is true to everybody in every time and in every place. If it is relative, it is true only to an individual in one time and in one place. But there's no such thing as a relative truth. It's self-defeating. If relativism is true, then nothing ultimately could be true, including relativism. There really is no distinction to make between that which is false and true. One cannot claim that it is an absolute truth that something is only a relative truth. But that's what is exactly being asserted by this notion of relativism as it's being applied to history. So it's completely untenable on philosophical grounds to maintain this notion of relativism, and therefore the only alternative is, because truth is absolute, And if we're going to make truth claims with respect to history, or any other subject for that matter, then they have to be understood in an absolute sense. What about the problem of presuppositions? Isn't the counting up of presuppositions, assumptions, and cultural influence as indicating relativity? I think not. I think this only compounds the self-defeating position of the relativist. Is all truth, historical included, based on presuppositions, assumptions, and cultural influence? If all truth statements are based on presuppositions, then it becomes an objective truth that all truth is based on presuppositions, and hence we have objective truth. Again, I don't think that the issue or the problem are people's having presuppositions. The issue that needs to be settled is, are these assumptions, are these presuppositions, are these cultural influences the correct ones, the right ones to have? Do they indeed correspond to reality? Now, of course, that is a question that may take us out of the realm of history, and that's fine to settle those things on other grounds related to the subjects that the presuppositions are being asserted in. That's certainly fine and important, but they don't negate objectivity completely. They don't. In fact, the fact that everyone agrees that we have them is indicative of the fact that there is still objectivity. Only the question of a correct presupposition really needs to be answered. Therefore, there must be some ground for all statements, historical or otherwise. Again, that ground must be objective truth. Here I want to just make a reference to the issue of supernaturalism versus naturalism. We've actually already dealt with this extensively, but I think it is important to bring up this issue in the context of dealing with the problem of history. While it is admitted that absolute objectivity is only possible for an infinite mind, because we admit that the historian is limited in terms of his resources and the collecting of evidences and what the human mind can understand. No one human being can understand all of human history. No one does. Some can do it with great skill and intellect and ability that is greater and better than ours, but it's still, in comparison to an infinite and eternal mind, falls well short of having a comprehensive understanding of all of history. We admit that that's only possible for God, who has an infinite mind. A theistic worldview does provide, however, the proper framework for the construction of a limited objective construction of the past that is, we admit, open to possible revision. New evidence might come along that needs to be incorporated into and perhaps adjust our hypothesis. So I would like to put forth the notion that objectivity in historical investigation is really only approachable, only able to be obtained in a limited sense that I just talked about, if certain metaphysical presuppositions or understanding or assertions are in fact true, and I would put forward the notion that they are also held by the historian. Now, this isn't the case that you can't have an atheistic historian, for example, come to a true understanding of something in history. But I would put forth the notion and assert that the atheistic historian does not have all the tools or all the correct presuppositions to understand everything he may come across in history. So the notion that these two things, at least minimally, need to be in place, that is, that theism is true, that is, that God exists, and so the second one is that miracles, the supernatural intervention into the natural world, is indeed possible. If those two things are not present in the worldview of the historian, then he doesn't have all that he needs to correctly interpret everything that he might come across. For example, something like a resurrection from the dead, as we'll see much later, an atheistic historian would not have the right presuppositions and understanding within their worldview in order to make a proper assessment of the evidence that might be indicative of such a resurrection. While the theistic historian, of course, would have everything they need if they in fact accept the existence of God and accept the possibility of miracles. There, the correct pre-understanding exists, and that historian has everything they need to accurately investigate and understand certain things that they might come across in history. In this last section, we'll deal with the nature and methodology of historical inquiry. Mortimer Adler identifies for us the nature of historical knowledge. He says this: on the one hand, we have self-evident truths that have certitude and incorrigibility, and we also have truths that are still subject to doubt, but that are supported by evidence and reason to a degree that puts them beyond reasonable doubt, or at least give them predominance over contrary views. All else is mere opinion, with no claim to being knowledge or having any hold on truth. There is no question that the findings and conclusions of historical research are knowledge in this sense. No question that the findings and conclusions of the experimental or empirical sciences, both natural and social, are knowledge in this sense. So it's important to understand that he puts the conclusions of historical research in the same category of the natural and social sciences. But it's also important to note that historical inquiry, as he makes reference to at the very beginning, lacks or precludes what is referred to as an apodictic proof. That is, it entails its conclusions with logical certitude, such as you would find in mathematics or perhaps in philosophy. Instead, historical analysis is capable of only establishing an inherent probability of the trustworthiness of a source, say something like the New Testament. It's Jacques Maritain in his On the Philosophy of History that actually lays out the importance of the historian himself. He says that for the historian, it is a prerequisite that he have a sound philosophy of man, an integrated culture, an accurate appreciation of the human being's various activities and their comparative importance, a correct scale of moral, political, religious, technical, and artistic value. The value, I mean the truth, of the historical work will be proportionate to the human richness of the historian. Here he lays out not only is it important, as we've stated, with regards to having the correct worldview, but the more of a Renaissance scholar that your historian is, that is, the more understanding he has of various human disciplines as well as man himself, the better history ultimately would come from such an individual. It would be important for the historian to have this type of grounding in order to approach the subject of history correctly. Now, I'd like to lay out for you, with the combination of two works on historiography, in outline form, a good or proper methodological understanding and approach to doing history. And of course, it is one that I think is important to lay out and set the parameters for, and then to be able to work within those parameters as we start our investigation of the New Testament. So the first one is Louis Gottschalk we'll look at, and the second one is C. Bean McAuliffe. But Gottschalk's work, Understanding History, seems to be a pretty standard historiography, and he says this: by its most common definition, the word history now means the past of mankind. Gottschalk states that the process of critically examining and analyzing the records and survivals of the past is here called historical method. And then the imaginative reconstruction of the past from the data derived by that process is called historiography, that is, the writing of history. So here he identifies or defines at least three terms for us that I think are important to understand. One, he defines history for us, which historians know and understand as the past of mankind. The second thing, he identifies that all historians are going to follow a historical method. It may be a bad one, it may be a good one, it may be an accepted one, it may be an unaccepted one, but nonetheless, they're going to go about it with some methodology or in some intent in place. And the second thing is they're going to write about it in terms of a result. And this, of course, is the process of historiography, that is, the writing of history. Now, McAuliffe's work, titled Justifying Historical Description, he says that a description of the world is true if one set of its possible truth conditions does exist or has existed in reality. So very well, he's operating here out of a correspondence understanding of truth. He says, Caesar's army crossed the Rubicon. The statement is very general, but there are many ways that it could have been fulfilled. The description is true if one of the many possible sets of conditions, truth conditions, occurred in reality. So this seems to be a good notion of historical truth. What about justifying historical descriptions? McAuliffe says this: justification conditions are reasons which we have to, at present, for thinking historical descriptions are true. For example, Captain Cook sighted Australia on 21st April 1770 is a past event in the world which corresponds to this description. The conditions which justify the statement, on the other hand, are documents such as Cook's journals from which it may be inferred. So in order to justify my description of history, it needs to have some corroborating evidence behind it in which to support it. And so, of course, this is what we would want to look for in any historical investigation. Now, also, Gottschalk makes an important distinction between primary and secondary sources, and this will be critical as we approach the New Testament as well. A primary source must have been produced by a contemporary of the events it narrates. It does not, however, need to be original in the legal sense of the word original, that is, the very document, usually the first written draft, whose contents are the subjects of discussion, for quite often a later copy or a printed edition will do just as well. In the case of the Greek and Roman classics, seldom are any but later copies available. So here he acknowledges that by primary source, it is not necessary to have the autographs, or which is a term we use with respect to the original copy, at least in biblical studies. Very often, later copies are just as well to use, but it is important to identify that the source must have been produced by a contemporary of the events. The central question after doing this is the issue of reliability. And of course, here you want to ask, was the author of the document able to tell the truth? And if able, was he willing to tell the truth? And of course, this is going to be examined and to be looked at by circumstances surrounding the document, and also its agreement or subsequent disagreement with other documents related to the same event. And of course, the historical circumstance surrounding the document would be important as well to examine. At least in terms of biblical criticism, although it is very prominent in other areas as well in terms of studying, there are at least two stories or two avenues of criticism that are leveled against the documents or made of the documents in order to arrive at a understanding that you have a good source in which to engage in historical investigation in. And this is the distinction between lower and higher criticism. Lower criticism examines the text itself. That is, it examines available manuscripts, sources that are used to compile a text, and attempts to reconstruct the original text. Here our concern is just with the reconstruction as closely as possible the original text. If all we have are copies that exist in terms of manuscripts that exist, it is here the science of reconstructing that text based on the available copies that we have, and of certainly being guided by a set of principles or rules that we want to follow that are put forth by experts in the field in order to allow us to come as closely as possible to what the original said in terms of wording. This will become crucial as we later investigate the New Testament and establish as best we can what the original or the autographs, which do not exist of the New Testament manuscripts, what they did in fact say in terms of their wording. Higher criticism examines the source of the text. It asks questions about the authorship, that is, who wrote it. When was it written? Is the content in there reliable? Here it would be important to assess the reliability of the content therein. Is it authentic? Again, here we go back to Gottschalk's question, were they able to tell the truth? And second, were they willing to tell the truth? And of course, this takes an understanding of the historical environment in which the document was produced and under the historical conditions that existed in which the document was produced. Now, lastly, we want to put forth the notion of testing a hypothesis. Once we have examined our documents in terms of lower and higher criticism, once we therefore interpret these particular documents with reference to the events, formulate a certain hypothesis with regards to these events, and the explanatory power of our hypothesis must then be put to the test. And it's McAuliffe that comes forth with at least some notion of how this testing might take place. So here's his historical hypothesis. He says it must meet these items. Imply further statements together with other truth statements that describe present and observable data. That is, our hypothesis must have greater explanatory scope, that is, imply a greater variety of observable data than rival hypotheses. It must have greater explanatory power, that is, to make the observable data more probable than any rival hypothesis. It has to be more plausible, that is, to imply a greater variety of accepted truths, negation implied by fewer truths than the rival hypothesis. And 5, it must be less ad hoc, that is, include fewer new suppositions about the past than any of the rival hypotheses. 6, it must be disconfirmed by fewer accepted beliefs. What we mean by that is that when it's conjoined with accepted truths, it has to imply fewer false statements than any of the rival hypotheses. And lastly, it must succeed its rival hypothesis in fulfilling conditions 2 through 6 that were mentioned above. So it seems to be the case that if we can put forth a hypothesis that is able to do these things better than any other rival hypothesis, then one ought to give their consent to our hypothesis, at least in terms of its ability to explain all of the data, and really give their consent to believe that our hypothesis is true because it is able to do these things better than any other rival hypothesis. But I want to lay out what will have to be done in terms of a historical investigation of our ancient sources concerning the New Testament and the events, of course, that we want to get to deal with the self-understanding of Jesus in terms of his deity and also his resurrection. It seems to me that this is a proper approach given the historical methodology that we've just laid out. First, we would have a documentary source investigation in which we would investigate the lower textual criticism, that is the reliability of the documents, that is the manuscripts that are extant, that do exist concerning the New Testament. And then second, we would assess the higher criticism reliability of those documents. Remember, that deals with the issue of authorship and date and so forth. And of course, we would do that in 2 steps. We would first assess the internal criterion of those documents. Then we would assess the external criterion of those documents. And then we would move on to, and if things are found to be reliable in our assessment under B with regards to historical criticism, we could move to actually interpreting those documents and then formulating a hypothesis with respect to the events at hand concerning those documents. And then, of course, we want to submit that test to what we just laid out regarding a hypothesis against rival hypotheses as well. That being the case, this seems to be a good, clear methodology in approaching our New Testament documents, and will give us the best results if we follow this. Let me review our outline of apologetic argument up to this point. What we've been able to do here is number 4, that is, history can reveal true knowledge about the past. Historical relativism, as we've argued here, is self-defeating, and a proper philosophy and methodology of history can reveal truth on the level of probability, which is the very nature of history itself. So the best we can hope for with regards to our subject of history is something that is highly probable to have occurred. And of course there we must pay close attention to our methodology and then ultimately to establishing our hypothesis as being true against and over against other rival hypotheses.